Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer, Teamwork Arts and the British Library, we welcome all of you to this session of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session is Virology and Race, Angelina Saini, Ajit Lalvani and Roger Highfield in conversation. Three eminent scientists examine the front lines of the battle against COVID-19. Ajit Lalvani and Roger Highfield consider the work of nations, international scientists, and the modern medical field, while Angela Saini explores the racial implications of the virus, its impacts on the BAME community, including a disproportionate number of deaths, the intersection between medicine and race, and the dangers of pseudoscience. Angelina Saini is an award-winning science journalist. Her latest book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. Ajit Lalvani is chair of infectious diseases and director of the National Respiratory Infections Health Protection Research Unit at the National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College London, and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. His remit includes influenza, tuberculosis, emerging respiratory infections, and pandemic preparedness, including the new emergent threats such as COVID-19. Roger Highfield is the science director of the Science Museum Group. He has completed his 8th book. 2 earlier books were bestsellers. He writes for Wired and is a visiting professor at UCL and the University of Oxford. All our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org. Our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Do follow our handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can log back on. Please do ask questions and comment by typing in the comment section. Do please consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap for JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view by clicking on the link below. And also please support the British Library by donating. Ladies and gentlemen, Virology and Race, Angela Saini, Ajit Lalvani, and Roger Highfield in conversation. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you so much, Anchor. Thank you to the JLF, to the British Library. And it's great to be here with Ange Saini and with Ajit as well. Now, obviously, at the heart of this conversation is the global pandemic, the havoc caused by a new coronavirus, an entity barely on the boundary of life and inanimate matter, 125 billionths of a meter across. And this virus, as well as being ageist, having a bigger effect on old people, as well as being sexist, affecting males more than women, seems to be racist as well. And if you look at the stats, you find that men and women from all ethnic groups are at greater risk of dying from COVID-19 than white people, according to one UK study. There was another big study of something like 31,000 patients in 260 hospitals that found that people from South Asian backgrounds were 20% more likely to die than white people. Let's just sort of put this in a bit of context. Ange, I wanted to start with you in the vexed issue of race science. You know, what do we mean by race? Can you give a sense of historic context and this unhappy relationship between race science and eugenics? You know, the idea that the genetic quality of the population can be improved.
I think a lot of people imagine race to be a tangible, visceral quality that has always been there. And me included, when I was writing Superior, it came as quite a shock to me to understand when you pick apart the history and the science and everything, and it does take a lot of picking apart to realize just how little basis it actually has, how little biological basis it actually has. Even these racial categories that we use now, the very broad ones like brown, black, white, yellow, red, are no more than a few hundred years old. So, 1,000 years ago, while I'm not saying that people didn't recognize human difference, of course they did, they certainly didn't use the racial categories that we had now. They didn't even use the word race the way that we use it now, if they hardly used it at all. So we have to understand race for what it is, which is an invention, a social construct. It was developed at a particular point in time, largely as a kind of arbitrary scientific exercise in some ways. So there were Enlightenment, these are European Enlightenment naturalists and scientists who were categorizing the natural world and thought, can we categorize humans in the same way, often with very little experience or understanding of how other humans actually lived. So they hadn't traveled, they weren't kind of carefully traveling the world and documenting what they were looking at. It was very vague. And some people thought there were a few races and other people thought there were hundreds of races or thousands of races. What we have now is a system as arbitrary as any of those, but it became pumped with meaning over time because of politics, because of slavery, because of colonialism in particular, that the categories that were invented at the time came to shape how people were treated. They came to shape injustice and mistreatment and oppression around the world by scientists included. Doctors and scientists in the 19th century in particular behaved in ways as that only reified these categories further. They would invent diseases that they thought only black people had. They would investigate the possibility that black people, for instance, had thicker skin or denser bones. There are still people who believe these racial myths now. There was a survey done.
I was going to say to you, Ange, there are so many scientists who naively think, look, we're looking for objective truth, that we're above all of this. But in fact, the story of science is completely intertwined with this and the toxic idea of race science.
Yeah, and it's still there. And I think that's what's played out in this COVID-19 pandemic. I was really surprised to see prominent doctors and scientists, not many, but some, speculating as to the possibility when we were seeing these racial disparities in health, especially early on in the pandemic here in the UK, that the differences they were seeing in the US and the UK might be down to some genetic factors without any evidence. We didn't have any evidence at that point. So it was very lazy speculation, and it fell into that same kind of 19th century trap of believing that there's a possibility that black and brown people have genes that make us more susceptible to this virus. And we don't have any evidence.
I think we should dig into that a little bit more a bit later. Let's go to Ajit now, because the last time, Ajit, we talked for the JLF, you gave this harrowing account of your own encounter with COVID and the kind of pernicious nature of this disease. I remember the dramatic moment when you felt after a week you were getting better, and then actually it entered a much more dangerous phase. A few months on, how do you feel now? Because I know that we're worried more and more about the long-term effects of COVID.
I've been fortunate, thank you, Roger, because once I got through the harrowing experience of acute COVID, which lasted 2 weeks, followed by a week or two of convalescence to get back to my normal strength, since then I've not really looked back. So I've been completely fine and thankfully managed to avoid subsequent, long-term sequelae. But these long-term sequelae do seem to be a problem. Clearly, the virus hasn't been around a long time, so there's a limited number of studies to date describing them. My team, together with my team, we just completed actually a systematic review of long-term consequences of COVID. And there are less than 60 published articles where patients have been followed up for periods of between 2 weeks to 3 months. None of them really go beyond that yet. And it's becoming clear that there is a burden of long-term consequence. How large that isn't clear. And I think maybe the best way for people to understand it is the one could say there are long-term, the commonest sequelae seem to be continuing to have shortness of breath on exertion for weeks and months afterwards. Fatigue particularly, and then also anxiety. So these are the issues. The loss of taste and smell can last a few months, but they do come back, it seems. And so at the moment, some of these symptoms are, you can see why they're happening. If you do CT scans or lung function tests 3 months afterwards, you can see damage to the lungs in a proportion of patients, which accounts for their persistent symptoms. But there are other persistent symptoms for which we haven't yet found the pathological basis. And I think we will do with time, but perhaps not for all of them, because I think that there will be also some people that continue to suffer anxiety, maybe a sense of shortness of breath, more because of the sheer stress of the experience of going through the illness, a sort of almost a bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, if you will.
I've heard people talk about the waves of impact of COVID, and obviously, I'll mention some of the death rates earlier on. That's the most obvious one. But now, of course, we've got the second wave, which is long COVID that you just talked about. There's a third wave in that there's no doubt that with health systems under pressure, that cancer patients are being neglected, heart disease patients are being neglected. There'll be a death rate from that. And then there'll be a fourth wave, which is when the economic impact comes in and acceleration of inequality in society and so on. So it's going to take us quite a long time, isn't it, to get the big picture of what the impact of COVID has been.
I think, Roger, that's a great way to look at it. And of course, all those waves you've mentioned, the third one being the other diseases, the treatment of which has been neglected, and the fourth one being the economic impact, all of those waves are not even, you don't even need the second COVID wave for that to happen, because the waves you've just described are already in train. They're going to hit us, and they are hitting us. And if we have a second COVID wave, then the waves you've just described will just be even more intense and even larger.
And just very briefly, Ajit, you're an immunologist, very eminent immunologist. I know you've been looking at the infections that are symptom-free, the risk factors that promote transmission of COVID, and whether you can find a kind of telltale immune response from a patient early in the disease where you can work out whether they're going to be in serious trouble or not. How I don't want to ruin your Science or Nature papers, but have you found any interesting things you can share with us?
I think what I can say is that to help people to understand, these are very difficult studies to do and haven't yet been carried out elsewhere in the world, at least not reported. And they center around what we call the golden window. And the point being that there is a short interval when a contact gets infected from a source case or an infectious index case, as we call it. There's a short window before that contact goes on to develop symptoms. And our goal has been and is to identify immune responses in that golden window, which is after exposure, before development of symptoms, identify immune responses at that early stage that will predict that contact's outcome, whether they'll go on to get severe illness or mild illness or indeed asymptomatic illness, which as we know is fortunately common, although they remain infectious. So we are correlating these early immune responses with the subsequent clinical and virological outcome. And I'm pleased to say that since we last spoke, the studies are off the ground. They've attracted interest and support from the Department of Health in the UK, who've kindly given a boost to the funding so we can answer even more questions than we originally planned. And we're beginning to see some interesting clues. We're beginning to see interesting clues. I think all I would say about that is that we're pleased that we were measuring immune responses very comprehensively. So we're measuring antibodies, blood responses, innate responses, T-cell responses in the blood, as well as in the airway mucosa, the nose and upper airway, which of course is the first part of the body that contacts the virus. So we're measuring responses in all these places and in you could call it very multidimensional. Yeah. So we're not going to miss the opportunity to identify which immune responses are the best at protecting us.
So before, Ange, I bring you back in, let's just go through, let's just frame our discussion with some of these rather terrifying statistics. So if you believe the official statistics, and there's a huge debate about this, we're heading for 30 million cases of COVID worldwide, 1 million deaths in India. We've got 4.7 million cases, about 80,000 deaths, again, official figures. In fact, I saw in the journal Nature, it reported that by next year, the outbreak in India is predicted to be the world's largest. In the UK, we're up to 360,000 cases, more than 41,000 deaths. And in fact, we know that 41,000 official figure is way short of the reality. The good news is, in terms of where the global scientific effort is, that actually thanks to a couple of very well-designed UK trials, we've got a couple of promising drugs for treating more severe COVID, dexamethasone and hydrocortisone. And I think the other global encouraging sign is we've got a lot of potential vaccines out there. I think there are 38 being studied. There are 38 in clinical trials, and there are 93 preclinical vaccines under investigation in animals. So there's an enormous amount going on. But Ange, just returning now to the vexed race question, you had this great article in The Lancet just recently where you were talking about this point that you just fleetingly mentioned about medical researchers raising the possibility that innate differences between racial groups cause the virus to hit some harder than others. Just flesh that out a bit, and also put it in the broader context of the fact that, as we heard at a big discussion we had in the Science Museum last year, that race science seems to be resurging, if anything.
Well, in some ways, these ideas never went away. There was a study done of medical students and junior doctors in a state in the US that showed that many of them, if not most, still believed one or more of those old 19th century racial myths, for instance, that black people have thicker skin or that their bones are denser. So these ideas are prevalent, I think, not just in wider society, but also we have to accept also in the scientific community and the medical community. And if you go to your doctor and they tell you that if you're from this background, you're more likely to get that, as a patient, then it also reinforces this idea that there might be deeper differences there. Now, that's not to say that human variation doesn't exist. That's not obviously what I'm saying. Of course, there is such a thing as human variation. We are more genetically related to people within our families and extended families, and that there's a fuzzy relationship there, but it doesn't rise to the idea that there are distinct groups. There are no black genes, there are no white genes. There's no gene that exists in all the members of one race and not in another race. And in fact, you know, when I was younger, I studied at the Department of War Studies at King's, and we were looking at bioweapons. One of the reasons it's so difficult to develop a bioweapon, like a disease, like this could be, like a virus could be a bioweapon, is that it's impossible to target one population. We're just not different enough to be able to do that. And this is what, you know, when you get pandemics like this, it just becomes clear how global they are likely to be. And yet, at the beginning of this pandemic, you might remember around January, February, there were very low case rates in Africa. And there was this racial myth around the world that black people couldn't catch COVID. I don't know if you remember that. And then in March, that racial myth got completely switched over when it became clear that black Americans and black Britons were dying at greater rates, that black people and brown people are somehow more susceptible to COVID-19. So this racial myth around this virus was overturned and switched to exactly the opposite in the space of a few months. And that just, I think, goes to show our globally our social willingness to buy into racialized ideas about health, even when we don't, like I said before, we don't have any evidence, we don't have any proof that there are these differences. Of course, if black and brown people were more susceptible, then we would expect the greatest rates in the world to be in South Asia and Africa, and we don't see that. Obviously, we don't see that.
You use this phrase, Ange, pathologizing blackness, which I think just says it all. So anyone who mutters about genes or even vitamin D, you know, obviously we've got to be skeptical of that. I have to say that for my money, the most convincing evidence has not come from the reductionist geneticists, but it's come from this body of work built over decades of actually, strangely enough, studying UK civil servants that showed that a Sir Humphrey tends to live much longer than a civil service messenger. It's amazing work done by Sir Michael Marmot. And it shows very vividly that if you look at social hierarchies, they map onto hierarchies of illness. I mean, are you persuaded by the Marmot hypothesis?
Yeah, absolutely. And race obviously overlaps heavily with socioeconomic status, different indices like discrimination and other things which are being explored, particularly in the US. There's been a lot of research over the years in the US on effects. For example, we know of that access to healthcare is uneven, that Black Americans are likely to go to hospital at a much later stage of the disease because of the costs associated with healthcare. That if you're a Black American, for instance, you're more likely to live in an environment that is more toxic, that, you know, closer to dangerous things.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's so many factors here, but socioeconomic status, I think, has to be one of the biggest ones. We know here in the UK, for instance, that there is a life expectancy gap between the rich and the poor of a few years, and that's been getting bigger over the last decade. And we also have to look, of course, at demographics. The virus hit in the UK, it hit London first, and London is a minority white British city. So, of course, at the beginning, the statistics were never going to look as they would if the virus were uniformly spread all over the country.
Ajit, when it comes to the reductionist picture of what's going on in terms of minority ethnic groups suffering more from COVID, I mean, does skin color tell you anything at all about your risk of moving to serious illness or risk of being infected or whatever?
Yeah, there's quite a lot to sort of disentangle there. And I think maybe I'd just make a few general points as a backdrop. And one would be that, you know, there are, in fact, predispositions that are associated with race. I mean, those are clear biological, epidemiological, genetic, ultimately, facts. So whilst there may be pathologization of blackness and other races going on in some people's heads around the world, the reality is that, for example, white females are more susceptible to osteoporosis than males, and particularly than, say, black males. That's just a fact. It's not racist. It's not pathologizing race. It's just stating a fact. Secondarily, related to skin color, of course, is vitamin D. And if you have pigmented skin, the more pigmented it is, the less sunlight gets absorbed in the skin and the less vitamin D gets produced in the skin, which is where it's made in the body. And so consequently, vitamin D deficiency, perhaps not surprisingly, is very much associated with pigmentation of skin. I think for me, the more relevant and actionable point that Saini made was to do with how socioeconomic disparities and unfairness and underprivilege co-aggregate with race, and how she eloquently described how African Americans have a much higher burden of ill health for the reasons she illustrated, which is not to do with their race per se. It's to do with the fact that they're poorer, they live in more polluted parts of town. There are all sorts of reasons around it. And so in that sense, because race co-aggregates with socioeconomic disparities, so what you described about Sir Michael Marmot's groundbreaking research applies very much to race. And then to be concrete about it, during the COVID first wave in the UK, it was clear that if you're underprivileged, you were twice as likely to get COVID and die from it. If you were Bangladeshi, independent of underprivilege, just being Bangladeshi made you twice as likely to get it and to die from it. So if you're poor in Bangladeshi, you're 4 times more likely to die from it. And to me, perhaps differently to Angela, that's not pathologizing race. It's not anti-Bangladeshi. It's stating a factual observation.
In fact, you're very linked, aren't you, Ajit, with you're the chair of the Bromley by Bow Centre in Tower Hamlets, which is one of the most deprived areas. How has that area responded to the COVID threat, and given your insights and so on?
Well, it's in those areas that these differences have been found. And the other one, of course, to mention is that non-communicable diseases, chronic non-communicable diseases, diabetes, obesity, heart disease are commoner in people of South Asian ancestry in the UK. So that also affects outcome. And in Bromley by Bow, you know, I sort of helped the team there to actually set up a grassroots test and trace system, where it's not just test and trace, but it's test, trace, inform, and support. And of course, many people in these communities don't have English as their first language. So to order a test online and so on, and many are digitally excluded and so on. So the community there really got it together with volunteers to enable a sensible test, trace, inform, support people through isolation. And that's happening in practice now. So it's really a grassroots community protecting itself, because often the national government response and the local government response wasn't appropriately tailored to local needs.
For my money, I mean, my personal experience, the closest I've been involved in this vexed issue of race science is a study I was involved with a few years ago, looking at intelligence and IQ. And obviously one of the big battlegrounds is if there's any link between race and IQ. I did an online test with a chap called Adrian Owen at the University of Western Ontario. About 60,000 people globally took part in this test, so it's quite a significant chunk of data. And we found that you could explain all the observed variations in cognitive ability with a minimum, but no fewer than 3 factors, memory, reasoning, and verbal factor. And in fact, we did follow-up brain scan studies that showed that they lit up, in effect, different circuits in the brain. And I suppose what I took away from this was that the idea that you could capture human cognitive ability in one number, IQ, is very debatable indeed. And then when you take Angie's point that the idea that race is a slippery concept that depends on your cultural background and so on. So any attempt, I think, to try and link race to intelligence is bound to be complete rubbish, to put it bluntly.
Completely agree.
So, and just to finish off the Marmot point, because Ange talked about it, but I think what amazes me is that when I talked to Michael Marmot about the relevance of his work to COVID, he talked about his 10 years on report, and he found that in the UK, life expectancy has failed to increase across the country and is actually declining for women in the worst off decile, in this sort of index of multiple deprivation. I mean, he put a surprisingly optimistic spin on it, that he said bizarrely that the fact the social gradient has increased in Britain gives him hope in a bizarre way that it can be pushed back the other way to get poorer groups healthy again. But I mean, Ange, presumably this seems to be coming over as quite a universal and important and probably slightly neglected impact on health.
Yeah, although it stands to reason, all over the world, people who are poorer have poorer health outcomes. We know that you're likely to have a lower life expectancy. I mean, the example I often like to give is when people doubt that these racial categories are as arbitrary as I promise you they are. You only have to look at the history to know that. Let's just look at the US, where we get a lot of our racialized data from, including data that's then used in UK health guidelines. So in the US, we know not just that race is a social category, as I said before, but it's particularly socialized there because, for example, a Black American can have just one African American ancestor and still be categorized as Black because of the way that Blackness is defined there, because of this racist one-drop rule that you can have only a minimal African ancestry and then still be categorized as Black. And in fact, many, if not most, Black Americans are of mixed ancestry because of the history of slavery. Black slave women were often raped and had children by white slave owners, and of course the long history of mixing ever since. And we have to remember the history of the US then in terms of racial mixing is a long one. So are we saying then that this group of socially defined Black people, so not in any way correlating with any one fixed ancestry, this group of people are so genetically disadvantaged that, as we know, they will die of almost everything at greater rates than white Americans, including infant mortality, that their life expectancy will be genetically lower than that of a white American. It just doesn't, you don't even need to be a doctor or an epidemiologist to know that that doesn't make any logical sense. How can a socially defined group in that way be so genetically disadvantaged that they will die of everything, almost everything, at greater rates than any other group? And that's the kind of nonsense sometimes that I think we still resort to, that we still think, and we don't look at that big picture, which is racial disparities in health have always existed in countries which suffer racism. Of course, this is not going to all be genetic. It can't be. It just can't.
We've got 5 minutes to go until we're going to take questions from the audience. And I would encourage you all to bombard us with questions, leaving the really difficult ones to Ajit, obviously. Let's just take a little bit of a step back and a look forward into the future for the last few minutes of the chat. Ajit, where are we? You know, you're an expert on immunology, and obviously we've got a vaccine in the works. There are antibody treatments. There's this slightly gothic, old-fashioned therapy of using blood plasma that's been around for 100 years that Donald Trump has backed. Do you see some, encouragement, some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of these sorts of therapies?
I do. I think that sometime next year, I wouldn't like to say exactly when, but sometime next year, I think we're likely to have a safe and effective vaccine. I think it's unlikely to be 100% effective. So I think we're going to have to continue to do a lot of other things to try to mitigate, even when vaccines become available, because there'll be more than one. And I think the immune therapies, obviously the most effective and the cheapest one of all, dexamethasone, have been transformative. I think perhaps looking to the future rather than I think about the science. I've said enough there, because I think there's a lot of unknowns. I think perhaps I could add that after you've had an infection, you probably remain immune for some time, immune from reinfection for a period, but then you may well become susceptible to reinfection as your antibodies wane. But then if you were to get reinfected, say a year or two down the line, my understanding so far is that your T-cell response would mean that a subsequent infection was much milder. So that's my overall projection. But I think just before we move to the Q&A, I would like in this setting, with Angela with us, yourself at the Jaipur Literary Festival, to point out how the virus actually is an acute magnifier of problems pre-existing in society. So underprivilege and poverty, we've talked about. Poorer end of the spectrum in the UK on good data, twice as likely to die. Similar for disparities around the world. And what I'd like to just point out is, if you look internationally, globally, and you look at the countries that have done best, and you mentioned earlier how in the UK we've had this widening health inequalities over time. Well, the countries with the least health inequalities are Scandinavia and Germany. And when you look at those countries and how they've handled their response, it's generally been very well. And a particularly interesting point here is that Sweden is an outlier because it had less draconian lockdown and so on. Yeah. Overall, over time, those countries, regardless of the extent of the lockdown, because Sweden is different, but regardless of extent of lockdown, it's those countries that have less health inequalities, more responsible governments that put the health and welfare of their citizens above most other things. They've been the countries and the populations that have responded the best, I would say. And you could, within Europe, you could contrast that, for example, with the UK, where we've had a far, far higher death rate than Scandinavia or Germany, regardless of lockdown or no lockdown. It's down to the nature of society and the inequalities. And COVID exploits those. And in a way, the virus is holding a mirror to the face of society and saying, this is the society you've created. These are the governments you choose to govern your country. Well, here's a mirror. This is what you get when you get a pandemic. Need no further than the United States and Germany for a comparison, if you like.
I think let's last of all go to Ange. And actually, I think one, just to end on a slightly more optimistic note, it's striking to me that the world's largest vaccine maker, the Serum Institute of India, that's agreed to make, I think, 1 billion doses of a coronavirus vaccine being developed in the UK. They've also agreed with the Indian government to reserve half the company's stock for India and to supply low-income nations as well, which is a great thing. Ange, in your very first book, which I remember very well, more than a decade ago, Geek Nation, you talked about the extraordinary kind of fecundity of India when it comes to science and technology. Just tell us a little bit about why India is playing such an important role in the global vaccine race.
Well, I think my book is a little bit old now, and of course, politically, a lot has changed since then, and a different political party has been in power for a while. So I don't know if all the goals and aims around scientific achievement that were there then are necessarily there now, but certainly there was such a kind of vibrant ecosystem, especially in certain cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad, to really develop not just the IT industry, which at that point was very verdant, but also the pharmaceutical industry. We know they've been producing generics for a long time, and there was a willingness at that point, I remember, to a drive to kind of push out of just producing generics and doing kind of backroom IT into being more creative and doing the kind of work that you see, for example, happening in places like Cambridge or Silicon Valley, the kind of exciting, forward-driven work. And I think that is what's happening now in India. There are difficulties. There are institutional issues as well, not least in retaining talent sometimes. But I think what we're seeing is not just India, but also China. So I spoke briefly about China, I remember, when Geek Nation came out. 2 places that over the last decade have really tried to surge ahead in terms of investment in building their science and technology background. There's an interesting stat that countries that invest more than 2% of GDP in research and development tend to be technologically far more kind of have on the cutting edge than other countries. And at that point, China, I think, was already there. India was trying to get there. The UK was really lagging behind. It was like dropping back when it came to R&D investment. I don't know where those figures are now, but I certainly think we're entering an Asian century in terms of R&D. That's not to say that the US and Europe won't still be there doing things, but that Asia is kind of joining them, and China in particular, I think.
Let's now whiz over to some questions here. Nitin asks Ajit, what do you think the biggest misconception about the virus is? And I guess the biggest unknowns would be interesting as well.
I think the biggest misconceptions are to do with, it depends which group of people have got the misconception, right? There are misconceptions of, depending whose head you're looking into, different people have different misconceptions. So I don't know which is the biggest one. I guess, at least from the media reporting I see, there's a lot of misconception amongst large parts of the population in the United States, right, where people feel that masks do more harm than good and don't want to wear them and so on. I think those are big misconceptions. I think another misconception is that, it's a harmless virus and it doesn't matter. I mean, we know it causes great harm, although fortunately children and young healthy people are protected in the sense they get infected, but minimally unwell. In terms of the big unknowns, I guess, whether how effective the vaccines will be is one big unknown. Another big unknown is how the virus will interact with influenza during the winter season. I think the entire Northern Hemisphere is going to face a difficult winter because we will have flu, as we do every winter, and that will be interacting with COVID, both the respiratory viruses infecting the same part of the body, the lung, and transmitted in the same way. Now, it might be that social distancing and masks, which we're doing to prevent COVID, may also reduce the incidence of flu. I'm hoping it will, but we don't know if that's the case or not. So this is a big unknown, how we deal with the second wave. And to me, I guess the biggest unknown is once we have some partially effective vaccines out there, To what extent will we still be living with the virus in daily life? In the sense, will a bunch of partially effective vaccines enable us to eradicate it? So I think probably yes, and probably that will happen over a couple of years, but we don't know. It depends on how effective those vaccines are.
When it comes to the second or winter wave, I talked to Dame Anne Johnson about this, who was on the Academy of Medical Sciences report. And
Yes.
of course, they did a worst case scenario planning where there'd be double the deaths over the next winter that we had in the first wave. And actually, what slightly depresses me is that was predicated on the R number reaching 1.7. And if you look at the latest imperial studies, we seem to be at 1.7 at the moment. So it is, it's no surprise, is it, that the UK government is battening down the hatches a bit now?
That's very well stated, Roger. I think I've nothing to add to that. I agree with you 100%. That's right. It's we're at a critical moment in the UK, certainly, but I think many countries are going to be at this critical moment, whether sooner or later.
And there's a question here from Rinda Aurora. In what ways do you think COVID-19 will change society's worldview?
Oh, do you know, I'm a really big Star Trek fan. I'll be watching all the episodes again during lockdown. I know everyone has their favorite box sets that they're watching. I'm watching Next Generation. And one thing that you see in that imaginary future society is that everyone works together, that the world has overcome poverty and health problems and everything by working together. And I hope that this pandemic might teach different nations that we need, in order to combat a threat like this, you cannot work in isolation. You can't have wildly different systems in different parts of the world, because it can't work like that. And whether we're applying this to a future pandemic, or whether we're applying it to climate change, or whatever big global response that we need to threats to our existence, I hope that we learn to work together. The problem is, of course, that right now, politically, we're at a time in which populism is rife all over the world. The far right is in resurgence. Ethnic nationalism, religious nationalism is becoming stronger around the world. Many countries are becoming more introverted, if anything, rather than globalist in their perspective. The UK is leaving Europe, for goodness sake. How much more less cooperative could we be? But maybe
let's not talk about the B issue, Ange. That's another 3-hour session. But there's another question here for you from Rachel. Do you think the impact or influence of race is inevitable with regards to all aspects of science?
Oh, is that for me or for?
Yes, that is. Yes.
I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's just the way that we in society now happen to think about human difference. You can divide humans up however you like. There is no kind of set rules around it. We could divide us by eye color or height or whatever, and you will find differences if you look at any of those measures. We happen to use race as a variable in this society. They don't use them everywhere, all over the world. And in fact, different countries have their own ways of defining human difference and their own racial categories. So, for example, someone defined as black in the US may not necessarily be defined as black in South Africa or in Australia or in the UK. So these are very country-specific categories that we're talking about, and they're also time-specific. They change over time. So what I do see happening is, I remember when I wrote that Lancet article that you mentioned earlier a few months ago, do you know how much heavy peer review that went under? 2 rounds of peer review. There was such a reluctance on the part of doctors to accept that what I was saying might be correct. But after it came out, there's been such a wonderful response of medical students, doctors, medical professionals saying to me, yeah, we're thinking again about the ways in which we use race. We have to think more carefully. That's not to say we shouldn't use race at all, because of course it does, because it is a social category like class, and we know that class matters to health outcome, it also matters in those same kind of ways. So it is appropriate to use it. The question is, do we use it appropriately? And I think that's something that's definitely being visited now. And I would urge people, later this year, The Lancet is going to have a special issue on race, to which I've contributed, and also a number of researchers at UCL are also working on that. And I think that will look at this issue in far more detail. So I urge people to look at that issue. And also another British Medical Journal special issue earlier this year looking at race in the NHS, which I think is important to read.
I should say, I should urge everyone to read Angie's book as well, which I've got right here. Very last question from Ria, which we can all have a go at. And Ajit, I'll start with you. Can we realistically ever expect the world to go back to normal? Ajit, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so as I've said, I think with a handful of partially effective vaccines used widely and taken up, in large proportion by the public, one can achieve then herd immunity through vaccination, and that would offer us to go back to what the questioner called as normal. But frankly, so the answer in a simple terms is yes, within a few years, I think, a couple of years perhaps. But when we say normal, actually the normal includes the risk of major pandemics every now and again. So that normal needs to be one with a high level of alertness and ready to respond appropriately. So it's it's a back to normal, but a normal where we need to be more aware and more alert that pandemics are natural things. They happen, and with more environmental destruction and proximity of virus-infected animals of different types, including bats, with human beings, there's a high likelihood there will be more pandemics going forward over time.
Ange, very briefly, what's your take on whether we'll ever get back to normal?
I really hope we get back to normal. I'd be very disappointed if we don't. But I agree completely with Ajit here that it's going to be a different kind of normal, perhaps. I think this is where the contrast between India and the UK is interesting, because when I lived in India, I think on the part of ordinary people, at least, there was an acceptance of a level of risk in everyday life that was much higher than the level of acceptance of risk in the UK. We are very intolerant of any kind of risk in the UK, whereas in India, I felt like everyday people, whether that's a good or a bad thing, you just know that your life hangs on a precipice more than you imagine that it does in lots of different ways. And we need to accept that to some extent. We need to accept a degree of risk in our everyday lives. We can't just kind of shelter it in forever. And that's perhaps, the big change that will happen.
I think for my money, I think the world won't get back to normal because I think it's changed. I think we're going to be more online. There's going to be less commuting. Hopefully, we're going to build back to a different sort of normal, and hopefully a better normal, just to be more optimistic. Anyway, thank you so much to the JLF, to Anchor, to Sanjoy, Namita, William Dalrymple. Thank you for all those amazing questions. And finally, thank you to my brilliant colleagues, Ajit and Ange. It's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, Angela, and Ajit, for such a fascinating session. While we all hope to go back to the old normal, let's just hope that we all stay well and blessed and welcome each other in this new normal. Thank you. Thank you once again for such a fascinating session. And thank you for all watching and being such a great audience. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. We hope that you will stay with us for all our sessions today and will join in for the debate at the end of the day. Our next session that will begin shortly is Vani, a family struggle through the Sri Lankan conflict. Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollock in conversation with George Alagia. We now present to you a short reading from the Jaipur Writers short series featuring writer Taran Khan.
Hi, my name is Taran Khan and I'm reading from my book Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Stories in Kabul begin with the phrase Yeki Bood, Yeki Nabood. There was one, there was no one. The phrase corresponds to the once upon a time of fairy tales elsewhere. Whichever way you choose to read this expression, it is a good place to begin the story of Kabul, a city that was and never was. Or, to use the trick of fables, there it is not. The story of Kabul begins with bridges, roads appearing on water. In one legend about its origin, it appeared as a magic island in the middle of a large lake. To reach the island, a king built a bridge or a pul made of straw, ka. The combination of the two words that created this bridge, Ka and Pul, gave the city he made on this magic isle its name. Kabul is an island, or so it appears to the outsider standing on one of its nondescript pothole streets. It deceives you with its high walls streaked with brown mud, punctuated by steel-topped gates. It hides behind the fine mist of dust that hangs over its streets and homes, so that the city appears as though from the other side of a soft curtain, like a mirage, a place that is both near and far away. But walk through the small opening in an entrance gate and everything changes. You enter lush gardens and beautiful homes, their rooms filled with books, carpets, photographs, and music. In the older quarters of the city, the flat mud roofs of tightly packed homes form a different kind of thoroughfare, an elevated path across secluded spaces that is protected from the public gaze. Elsewhere there appear landscapes of homes clinging to the hills, their windows half reflecting the sky, half revealing glimpses of life in the rooms within. The city appears with the shift in perspective. As a child, I was fascinated by a tiny kaleidoscope my father bought me. It was a plastic tube with a transparent cap at the end, filled with pieces of broken bangles, colored glass of different sizes. I was riveted by this transformation of everyday objects into the fragments of a magical landscape. And I was drawn to how a simple shift of my wrist or even of my eye would make the pieces rearrange themselves into a new picture. Walking in Kabul is like looking through the kaleidoscope. Fragments fall into place, the familiar appears new. There it is not. Kabul appears where you don't expect to see it.
Hi friends.
Hi kids.
Hi everyone.
Hello दोस्तों. Welcome.
Welcome everyone.
Hello everyone.
I'm happy to welcome you to the magical world of stories. Kahani.
Don't you just love getting lost in the world of stories? We're here to hear some of our favorite stories.
Take hold of your hammer and make that clicky sound. Let's go. Move it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and round.
Today I am going to tell you how you can create the puppet, a tabletop puppet. हमारा puppet तैयार है परफॉर्म करने के लिए.
हेलो दोस्तों, कैसे हैं आप सब? मेरा नाम इचिका है.
Hello friends, I'm going to teach you how to write a short story.
So, the new magical words were bidim, budum, bhada. Ready? Bidim, budum, bhada.
On a mountain of sacks and bags of food that he'd taken and tricked out of the other animals, that is, until along came the rabbit.
If you have any stories we should hear or any stories you want us to tell everyone, write to us on kahani@kahanifestival.com. Who knows, we might be telling your story next. Bye bye. See you next time.